Hello, dairy production students. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about animal well-being. We've kind of talked now through all of the basis of dairy production. We're not going to get to genetics and financials, but we've talked through nutrition and repro and mastitis. And so now let's talk about animal well-being that has been at the forefront of the dairy industry and has become more important in the last years. And this is our typical reaction when we start debating animal well-being. It's a really complicated issue and people get really heated over it very quickly. However, we have to debate it or we don't make any progress when talking about animal well-being. There's been a lot of animal rights movement lately, and in the last year, we've seen a lot of animal well-being issues brought to light in the dairy industry, and so it's really important for us to talk about animal well-being. This is a graph that really shows the distribution about where people are in when talking about animal well-being. So we have the extremists in animal agriculture on one end that say everything's fine, we don't have to make any progress. And then we have PETA and HFUS on the other side of the spectrum that want animal agriculture to be abolished. And then there's people in the middle that are like consumers, there's producers, legislatures, things like that, that are really trying to help animals, push animal well-being forward, and say we're doing a good job, but of course with everything we always have room for improvement. However, when we're talking about animal well-being, most people don't know anything about it because it's not just as simple as we give cows feed and water. It's a lot more complicated. So what is animal welfare? And I am in my garage and we have a low battery out here, and so you're going to hear that beeping throughout the lecture. Sorry about that. So what is animal welfare? Animal welfare is the state of well-being brought about meeting the physical, environmental, nutritional, behavioral, and social needs of the animal or groups of animals under the care, supervision, or influence of people. So you can see it's not just straight, we feed cows. There's so many other things like behavior and social aspects that go into animal. Animal welfare, I use interchangeably with animal well-being. So well-being really is a balancing act. Stress has two purposes, right? It can be both positive and negative. I think a lot of younger people think that stress is completely negative, but some of you may thrive off a little bit of a stress, right? A lot of professors thrive off a little bit of stress. There's a ton of work to do. Expectations are super high, demanding. There's lots of demands from administration. And so all of us really, all professors really kind of strive off of that stress. And so positive stress really satisfies the need for excitement. But when stress is negative, is when it interferes with homeostasis and life functions. And so there's a lot of different aspects going into well-being. There's physiologically well-being aspects, but there's also psychological aspects, which we'll talk about throughout the PowerPoint. And a lot of times the perception of animal agriculture in general by the public does not always match reality. So a really good example of this is that a lot of people that don't know animal agriculture really hate the word barn. They think that barn is an awful thing. They don't want cows in the barn. But when we have done some research, there was some research done in Canada actually a few years ago, giving cows preference. Do they want to be in the barn or do they want to be out to pasture? And when it's really hot, like it is in Texas, the cows want to be in the barn. The cows chose to be in the barn. So the perception by what the people actually think about doesn't always match reality, and that's why we need scientific basis for making management decisions, and is why animal well-being is such an important issue, and why there's a lot more professors that are focusing on animal well-being. Animal well-being welfare really affects a lot of different groups of people within the industry. So it affects the industry in general. It affects activists. It affects retailers and how they make decisions on how they're going to buy food. It affects consumers, and it obviously affects animals. And welfare really encompasses physiological health, hygiene, and comfort, as well as the mental and psychological health of the animal. And so we need to make a lot of recommendations for management going off science, but also ethics and how people view. So how do you all view these animals, right? How do you view a dog or a cat, horse, cow, things like that, right? Our culture really tells us that we need to treat all of these animals differently, but why? We don't really have a great answer for that, right? Like if I told you that we were gonna have a dinner party tonight and we were gonna eat dog, most of you might say, no thanks, I'm not coming. I'd probably try dog. I don't want to eat my own dog, but I would try dog. But when we're looking at other cultures, they eat dog all the time, right? Dogs are not pets to them. And so it's interesting to see how every person views all these animals differently. When we're talking about animal well-being, one of the words that we need to talk about is anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. It's a difficult word to say, but I love it because it means the attribution of uniquely human characteristics to non-human creatures and beings, natural and supernatural phenomena, material states, and objects or abstract concepts. And we see a ton of anthropomorphism going on in the world around us. Lots of different anthropomorphic animals, right? Like Babe and Mickey. You can see the Lion King down the bottom left there. So it's interesting that people anthropomorphize a lot, right? They kind of think how they can tell cows how they're. So a lot of people anthropomorphize animals, they may feel bad for them, but they're not human. And a really easy way to think about anthropomorphism is if you're sitting at a desk, right, like hit the desk, and if your friend says, oh, poor desk. Well, no, not poor desk, because it's not a human. It doesn't have those human emotions, and your friend is anthropomorphizing that desk. A lot of times we need to talk about animal well-being, even though it's an important issue. As of recently, it's actually it's been along for a long time, right? So when we're talking about secular, animals are not rational, they don't speak, so they're not human. But then on the theological side, it says that animals are here for us to use, but mistreatment is bad for how people treat people. So a lot of times I'm not trying to get religious here. I'm just trying to show you what's in scripture, is that there are scriptures that saying treat animals correctly, right? Give animals a day off, take care of them correctly. A righteous man cares for his beasts. So even though animal well-being, animal welfare is kind of a new hot topic, it's been around for time. A lot of times when we talk about animal well-being, people really love, like, quote unquote, back in the day. So they think that back, like when my grandfather had a dairy and my dad was growing up, that the cows had proper animal care, they had individual attention. They thought that all of their decisions were ethically driven and that the animals contributed to human health and it was environmentally friendly. Now, a lot of people view animal agriculture as that we're exploiting the animals, that it has corporate control, it's profit driven, animals contribute to human illness, and it's environmentally negative. If I'm just giving a big picture view, I think animals are much more better taken care of now than they were back in the day. They didn't know about heat stress back in the day, so cows weren't being cooled. Their nutrition was not what it is now, and so it's we have a lot more information about how to take care of the environment, and they definitely did not before. So it's interesting to me to see how people view animal agriculture back in the day compared to now. So something that's really difficult with the Farmer's Challenge is that few people have direct or indirect connection to production agriculture, right? 2% of the world feeds the entire world. And people are really 2 generations removed from agriculture. And so that's really difficult for the farmer to tell people, show people what they're doing all the time. And the media is going to change people's views of animal care. And so sometimes changes are needed, right? We always have room for improvement, but sometimes, like a barn being a bad word, there isn't, that perception is there, and that's really confusing for people. And so the industry definitely has to be open to change for to improve animal well-being, and they are, but we shouldn't view the industry as that we're exploiting animals and things like that, as I just talked about. Slide. So there are the potential for quote unquote new types of animal suffering. So how do new production practices affect disease, right? When cows produce a lot of milk, there's more risk for mastitis. And so that could be a new type of issue, right? Our cows are producing a lot of milk, so maybe they have more mastitis than they did previously. Or sometimes maybe there's physical and psychological deprivation in confinement. If maybe the cattle don't have access, to really comfortable areas to lie down, or they don't have proper nutrition or water. And then something that we see with labor is that we're getting a lot of labor that they're coming to the dairy because they need a job, but that doesn't mean that they really want to work with animals or are animal smart. And so they don't have that animal sense that probably a lot of you do. And so that could lead to new types of animal suffering. So we have a new social ethic now, and all of this information comes from Bernie Rollins. He is kind of what we call the grandfather of animal welfare. There's a lot more updated information since he started really talking about this a lot. So a lot of this information comes for him. And so when we're talking about animals, there's been really a changing demographic for animal well-being and animal rights people, because the media really plays up animal well-being and really can sell animals really well. And when we look at like HSUS, there's been some very strong arguments by famous people. And so that can really change how people view animal agriculture, whether it's correct or not. And so I just told you about Bernie Rollins. He really is like the grandfather of animal welfare. And so there's some new social ethics about animals, like if they're suffering from things like castration or dehorning. And so when we're talking about animal well-being, there are certain social expectations about what constitutes humane treatment. And so we're talking about that. We need to talk about a word called telos. Telos is a nature, a function, a set of activities intrinsic to an individual or of a particular species, evolutionary determined and genetically imprinted. This means the cowness of a cow, fish have to swim, birds gotta fly, things like that. They are essential to animal well-being. So to promote animal welfare of animals, we need to raise them in ways that respect their natures. So that means allowing cows to do things like ruminate, to chew, don't socially isolate them because they're herd animals. Allowing fish to swim, don't keep them just in a tiny bowl for their size. Things like that. So when we look at these pictures, is this telos or not, right? Telos for cows. Cows need to chew, pigs need to root, cats need to groom, birds need to fly. However, when we look at a lot of anime or Disney, right, pigs don't fly, cows don't talk, and dogs definitely don't gossip. So some of the more of the Bernie Rollins philosophy is that animals and humans definitely are different. So we don't need to treat them the same. They don't have the same rights, but animals are important, and their natural activity is really important. So allow the animals like pigs to root and allow cows to chew, right? Don't try to put cows into an aspect or into a facility where they can't chew or where they can't be social with other. So now that we're assuming that a cow has needs, how are we going to, right? They do have needs, right? They have nutrient needs, social contact needs. They need to explore. There's thermoregulation needs. So talking about heat stress or cold stress. They need to rest. They need to feel safe. And they need to have some type of psychological stimulation. And we're talking about those needs. We talk about the 5 freedoms. And those 5 freedoms are: first, freedom from hunger, thirst, and malnutrition; freedom from discomfort; freedom from pain, injury, and disease; freedom to express normal behavior; and freedom from fear and stress. And so some ways that we can assess animal well-being are different indicators like productivity, health, stress, behavior, or then we can use things like expert opinion on assessing the farm and the cattle and saying, yes, these cows have good well-being. So we're talking about animal behavior. That is the aggregate of the responses or reactions or movements made by an organism in any situation. It's what the animal does, is basically what it comes down to. So to understand what a behavior means to an animal welfare, we need to understand within the context of what the ancestors did, or their feral relatives, or a domesticated animal in a semi-natural environment. And so when there's a question that I'm going to bring up, right, is allowing an animal to perform natural behaviors important for its welfare? I don't know, it kind of depends on if there is a behavior need or if it affects behavioral development. Animals are really highly motivated to perform certain behaviors, and those requirements are based on the biology of the animal. I read a paper out of I think it was back in the 1980s, so it's 30 years old, and these researchers were trying to evaluate how important rumination was to cattle. And so they put on these like masks basically that did not allow the cow to chew or cud or to ruminate. And this, we would never be able to pass this through research, but this is back in the day when you could do what you wanted. So they put these masks on these cows. There was like 4 steers to try to see if they could stop them ruminating. And one of the cattle died because they didn't allow them to ruminate. And so that there are behaviors that animals need to perform, and in cows' case, they need to ruminate. So when we're looking at cattle, let's talk a little bit more about cattle, right? There's a prey species. So they associate negative and positive experience with people and places. So if I was to wear a blue shirt and I was to constantly beat on a cow would then be afraid and associate a blue shirt. So if you put on a blue shirt and went up to that same cow, they're probably going to run away because they are associating that blue shirt. It's the same thing where when cows are lame, they don't always like to lay down. And the reason why is because it's very painful for them to lay down. And so they associate with that. So then they want to stand up longer. So cattle also have both long-term and short-term memory. They hear lower volumes, higher frequencies, and they're less able to locate sound sources. And they also have blind spots and really poor depth. So when we're looking at the flight zone, right, this is just how close you can come to a cow before a cow runs away. Some cows have no flight zone that you can just rub all over a cow and they won't move. Some cows you can get within 100 feet and they just run away. And so the blind spot you can see is right behind the cow. And if you want to move a cow, their shoulder is really their point of balance. So if you want a cow to go to the right, you'll go up to her left shoulder. If you want a cow to go left, you'll go up to her right shoulder. And then if you're trying to move a cow forward, you need to go past her shoulder. And if you're trying to move her backward, then you need to go before her. Stereotypies is an interesting concept within animal agriculture. I kind of love this word. It's a repetitive, relatively invariant behavior with no obvious function. And it really is a chronic overreaction to minimal stimuli. And in order for it to be an actual true stereotypy, it has to be repeated over a long period of time. So things like tail biting, feather pecking, tongue rolling, barb biting, and cribbing are all examples of stereotypy. And so if you see an animal is doing a stereotypy, you need to look hard at the context and what the stereotypically is actually, if it's actually a function. So when we're talking about tongue rolling with cattle, it's really interesting because Jerseys have a tendency to tongue roll even more. And we think of tongue rolling as, an overreaction to minimal stimulation, but even Jerseys that are out to pasture will still tongue roll. So we're not actually really sure in the dairy industry if tongue rolling is a true stereotypy. When I think of a stereotypy, I think of like wolves in zoos that just pace back and forth. Same thing with bears, right? They're just pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That is, to me, like the prime example of a stereotypy. We're talking about animal well-being. We should talk about fear and anxiety. So fear is really the perception of an actual danger, and anxiety is perception of a potential danger. And some of those physiological indicators that we can measure are things like heart rate, epinephrine, or cortisol in the blood to see how anxious and fearful the cows are. And so cows nowadays have new fears, right? Back in the day, they would be fearful of maybe a wolf trying to eat them. And now it's if the floor is slippery in their housing. They don't like environmental changes. New environments are not good. That's why we shouldn't move cattle a lot. They should stay in the same pens. And averse handling, right? A lot of people shout at cattle to get them moved up to a pen, and that is not a proper way to handle cattle. They've done some research and they have the same reaction to being shouted at as they do if they receive an electrical prod. We talked about stress earlier and how it can be both positive and negative. But stress is the biological response that an animal uses to defend its homeostasis from both external and internal challenges. And so some physical stress that we see are things like overcrowding, transportation, castration, and then the psychological stress are things like boredom or rough. So there are some welfare concerns for dairy. Some of them I agree with, some of them I don't. These are things that people have said. So lack of opportunity to graze, metabolic problems like the transition diseases that we discussed, and infectious diseases following parturition. Lameness is probably the number one animal well-being issue within the dairy industry. Pain from dehorning, transportation issues, especially transportation stress, and then inadequate facilities for sick or injured. Rough handling, downer cows. How are we handling those cows that are down on their own? How is euthanasia being handled on farm? Early calf separation from the dam, lack of calf socialization, right? We talked about how hutches are the main source of housing for cattle, but that's a big issue in the dairy industry for people that are not in the dairy industry. Inadequate colostrum for bull calves. Bull calves do not get the proper amount of colostrum that they should throughout the industry compared to female calves. How are veal calves raised? And heat stress. Some painful procedures that we do in the dairy industry are things like dehorning, castration, tail docking, and branding. And when we're talking about housing, there's some welfare concerns for both outdoor, indoor housing, right? So outdoor, how do we handle inclement weather? How do we handle parasites? What about poor walking tracks? We talked about, I think it was when we were talking about mastitis or about parlors, that cattle sometimes have to walk a long ways from pasture to the milk parlor, and if there's stones on where they're walking, it can be really painful. Lack of human supervision, and then predation. And then indoor housing, sometimes if they're overcrowded, there can be insufficient space, uncomfortable flooring, poor drainage, so then they're standing in water all the time, uncomfortable lying areas, poor ventilation, heat stress, and increased disease transmission because cattle are now grouped. So what do consumers want when we look at animal well-being? So they want quality of life, right? Pre-harvest conditions for animals, and they want training for workers. They want humane transport and processing. They want a good quality and safe product. They want the animals to be raised environmentally responsibly, and they want oversight in the process, meaning they want some type of certification, accreditation, or assessments and audits for people that are raising and harvesting animal culture. And so there has been some studies looking at what consumers believe animals need to have a decent life. And so lots of different options there. Mainly is how they're treated when they're sick. And then after that, allowing them to exhibit their normal behavior. They want them to go outside and have exercise outside. They want them to be protected from other animals. And then they want them to have a shelter at a comfortable temperature. So dealing with heat stress, socializing, especially since cattle are such herd-oriented animals. And then they want them to have a comfortable place to stay. And so this was some open-ended consumers' thoughts about animal well-being. And so the majority of people think that animals raised under higher standards of care will produce safe and better tasting meat. And then people really agree that farm animals do feel pain the same way that humans do. One thing that consumers really agree with is that farm animals raised on small farms have a better life than raised on corporate farms, and animals raised on a small farm have a better life than raised on large farms. And we know that there's been some research done looking at animal welfare on both small and large farms, and it actually doesn't matter the size of the farm. It just comes down to management. So even though we know that, that's not always the perception of consumers. So we just talked about accreditation for animal agriculture so we can have oversight. There are different types of industry efforts within the industry that are doing accreditation. So the biggest one is the National Dairy Farm Program, the Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. Almost all of the dairies are involved with some type of third-party accreditation. If they're not selling, they're not going to be able to sell their milk to like a cooperative. And so I'm going to have you all watch some of the animal well-being and stockmanship videos from the farm program. So there are third-party audits that are going on within the. So protecting animal welfare really isn't new, but the programs, the auditing programs are new. So like that NMPF, National Milk Producers Federation, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, that is a relatively new program. And so these third-party audits can really measure a producer's or a packer's level of compliance against a prescribed set of animal care criteria. So like allowing cows to always have access to water, how many cows are lame, how many cows have broken tails, things like that are areas that are being audited on the farm. However, sometimes there are some problems with the audits, so there's not a standardized system. So that can be really difficult. And then auditing firms really differ, right? All of those different types of audits that I just told you are all different. I was talking with Dean Foods a few years ago when Dean Foods was still a company, and they had their own auditing system because they didn't actually like all of the other auditing systems that were out there, right? So there's not a standardized audit. There's not one single audit that every single dairy person has to follow. And then the auditor qualifications vary. So in December, there was National Milk Producers Federation had a training at the dairy, and it differed a lot for them. There were some people that there was from like veterinarians all the way to some people that worked for a cooperative, and so the qualifications really differ. So when we're looking at the assessment with the third-party evaluation, it's going to evaluate different areas of welfare on the farm, and it's going to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the farm. Then they will always interact with the producer to tell them what they could improve on. And so it's more of an educational opportunity for the dairymen to improve their farm. So some areas of assessment besides things like broken tails, they're going to look at the nutrition of the animals, the hygiene of the animals, lameness. They'll look at replacement heifers. What do their medical procedures look like? What type of training programs do they have on their farm? What are the programs? And so wanted to reiterate that certification is needed and that the auditors need to be trained really as a professional in their discipline. And it needs to be independent of the dairy farm because this brings more credibility with customers. It has to be science-based and needs to be qualified by education and experience for each species. And they need to be trained by professional animal sciences, scientists, and veterinarians. And then the audit firms could be certified as having qualified auditors and appropriate audit. So just remember things like the National Dairy Farm Program, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management, party audits. There are some other new developments in animal well-being, like having the technology to measure well-being. So if we could put a precision technology, which we're going to talk about in the next lecture, on a cow to measure their behavior and measure what their animal welfare is like. So there is actually a movement over, I think in Scotland, where a technology company is trying to use a technology to assess animal well-being, and then through that technology they will give each farm that has this technology a rating on their animal welfare, and the farms that have better animal welfare are going to either get paid more for their milk, or their milk is going to be a higher price in the grocery store. So there are efforts in the dairy industry to improve animal well-being. I think it's really great that we're having improvements. However, I also think that animal well-being has come a long way since like my dad grew up on a farm. And so when we're talking about animal well-being is it's complex. There are absolutely no solutions to make everyone happy. The behavior and the physiology can be used to research best practices for animal care, and we're still learning about exactly what cattle need so that they have animal welfare. When we're talking about farmers, they can't just stick their head in the sand and say there's no issues, and a lot of them don't. A lot of them try to improve their farm and their practices. However, when we're talking about on the consumer side, they're going to have to pay higher prices for their milk so that farmers can get more money for their milk. Whole other issue. So